The alarm started before anyone even saw the ship. I was standing on the observation deck of Vantheon Academy when the proximity sensors screamed loud enough to shake dust from the ceiling vents. Every instructor on the station froze mid-sentence. Every cadet near a window pressed against the glass. Something had entered our system without asking permission, without sending a greeting, without doing any of the things a civilized fleet was supposed to do before crossing a border. My name is Kale Driss. I am a Velkari, and my people have hunted on 11 worlds. We do not scare easily, but that day, watching a single unfamiliar vessel slide out of the dark like it owned the space around it, I felt something cold move through my chest that I did not have a word for yet. The ship was small. That was the strange part. Every warning light on the station expected something massive, something built to announce its power through sheer size. Instead, we got a compact gray hull, scarred along one flank as if it had been dragged through fire and had simply kept going anyway. It did not slow down for the checkpoint buoys. It did not respond to the automated challenge signal. It simply corrected its course, entered orbit with a precision that made our navigation officers curse under their breath, and sent one message: requesting dock and resupply. Routine visit. Routine, as if an unknown species crossing into a heavily defended academic sector was an everyday errand. The High Council debated for 6 hours before allowing it to dock. I know this because my cousin serves in fleet communications, and she told me the recordings later, her voice still shaking. The ship was human. None of us had ever seen a human before. We had heard rumors. Whispers passed between traders who did business on the edges of known space. Stories that were usually dismissed as exaggeration, meant to frighten young cadets into behaving. A species that fought wars against itself for thousands of years before it ever left its home world. A species other empires had quietly agreed to leave alone, not out of kindness, but because the handful of encounters on record ended badly for whoever started the trouble. I did not think about any of this seriously. Not yet. To me, humans were still a story, and stories cannot enroll in your academy. That changed 3 days later. I was sitting in the administration hall waiting for my schedule confirmation when I heard 2 clerks arguing behind the counter. One of them kept repeating the same sentence, over and over, like saying it again would make it less true. The registration says human. It says human cadet, approved, first-class combat division. The other clerk laughed, the kind of laugh people make when they think something is obviously a mistake. He said the system had glitched, that a supply manifest from the human vessel must have crossed wires with the new cadet intake, that no academy on record accepted a species outside the recognized combat tiers without a formal review process lasting cycles, not days. I should have walked away. Instead, I stayed by the counter pretending to check my own files, listening. The senior clerk pulled up the enrollment record on the display, and for a moment nobody spoke. I could see the glow of it reflected in her eyes. A name, a species designation, none of us recognized as a combat class. A signature from someone aboard the human vessel that the system had accepted as valid academic transfer, using an old diplomatic exchange clause nobody had touched in generations, buried so deep in the founding treaties that most administrators did not know it still existed. The clerk who had been laughing stopped laughing. I want you to understand something about Vantheon Academy before I go further, because without understanding what this place is, you cannot understand what happened next. Vantheon does not accept weak species. It never has. The Academy sits at the center of an old alliance between predator worlds, places where every child grows up learning to fight before they learn to read, where strength is not just respected but required for survival in the systems that produce them. Every cadet who walks through its gates has already survived selection trials that kill the unprepared. We are the ones who did not die trying to get here. A human should not have been able to enroll, not because of prejudice, though there was plenty of that in the halls that week, but because the entrance requirements were built around thresholds no soft, short-lived species was supposed to reach. Reflexes measured in fractions most bodies cannot achieve. Endurance tests that broke cadets from species twice the size of an average human. Pain tolerance thresholds calibrated against creatures with armored hides and multiple hearts. And yet the record sat there on the clerk's screen, glowing and undeniable. Approved. Combat Division. First row eligibility. I did not think much more about it that day. I had my own trials to worry about, my own rank to protect among cadets who would gladly take my place if I stumbled. Velkari society does not forgive weakness, even the appearance of it, and I had spent 3 cycles clawing my way toward a respectable position in my cohort. Whatever clerical mistake had let one lost human onto a warship's supply list was not my problem. I was wrong about that too. Almost everything I believed that week turned out to be wrong. The orientation hall filled up an hour before the ceremony was supposed to begin, the way it always does when a new class arrives. Cadets from a dozen predator worlds crowded the tiered seating, each of us sizing up the others out of habit more than hostility. There were Threll war clan youths with plated shoulders and short tempers, Asuvari twins from the ice continents who never spoke unless spoken to, a scattering of species I only recognized from trade broadcasts. Every single one of them was built for violence in ways their bodies made obvious just by existing in a room. I remember the exact moment the doors opened at the back of the hall, because the entire room went quiet before anyone announced anything. That kind of quiet only happens when something unexpected walks in. She was small. That was the first thing every cadet in that hall noticed, and judging by the way postures shifted around me, the first thing every cadet in that hall judged her for. No armor plating, no claws, no obvious weapon systems built into her body the way half the room carried them naturally. She wore a simple gray uniform that looked almost identical to a human military work uniform I had seen in an old trade broadcast, patched at one shoulder where something had clearly torn the fabric, and someone had stitched it back together by hand rather than replacing it. Her hair was dark, cut short, and practical. Her skin carried a thin white scar along her jaw that caught the light when she turned her head. She walked into that hall of predators with her hands loose at her sides, no tension in her shoulders, no wariness in her stride, scanning the room, the way you might glance around a quiet library, not the way you look at a room full of creatures that could tear you apart without much effort. Her name, according to the registration display above the entrance, was Mara Voss. Every seat in that hall carried an unspoken order. Rank mattered here, and rank was earned through combat scores, through trial performance, through the kind of reputation that took cycles to build. The front row belonged to whoever held the highest standing in the incoming class, a Threll cadet named Oren Kess whose trial scores had already made instructors take notice before the term even began. Nobody sat in that seat without permission. Nobody dared. Mara Voss walked straight down the center aisle, past rows of cadets who stopped mid-conversation to watch her, and sat down in the front row, one seat away from Oren Kess, without asking anyone, without checking a seating chart, without the slightest hesitation. Then she smiled, not a nervous smile, not the kind of smile a creature gives when it knows it has made a mistake and hopes nobody notices. It was easy, almost pleased, the way you might smile settling into a comfortable chair after a long day. She looked around at the rows of armored, clawed, multi-eyed cadets glaring at her from every direction, and her smile only widened slightly, like she found something about the whole situation quietly amusing. Oren Kess turned his head slowly to look at her. I watched his jaw tighten, the plates along his shoulder rising the way they do when a Threll prepares to assert dominance. In our academy, that kind of challenge usually ended with somebody being escorted to the medical wing before the first lecture even began. He did not get the chance to say anything. The instructor who ran orientation, a scarred veteran named Commander Threx Val, walked onto the stage at that exact moment, and the whole hall fell silent, out of old habit and older fear. Val had trained 3 generations of cadets. He did not tolerate disruption during his welcome address, not even from cadets defending their rank. His eyes found Mara Voss immediately. Of course they did. Everyone's eyes had found her immediately. He paused for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might order her removed on the spot, might call the whole enrollment a mistake in front of everyone, and end this strange chapter before it truly began. Instead, he said nothing about her seat at all. He simply began his address as if nothing unusual had happened, welcoming the new class to Vantheon, reminding us that only the strongest among us would graduate into positions worthy of our home worlds, that weakness had no place within these walls. I watched Mara Voss listen to every word of that speech, with the same relaxed, faintly amused expression she had worn walking in. She did not flinch at the word weakness. She did not seem to take it personally at all, the way a cadet who belonged somewhere else entirely might simply let words meant for other people pass over her without landing. I leaned toward the cadet beside me, a quiet Osuvari named Fane who rarely spoke to anyone, and I asked the question everyone in that hall was thinking but nobody had said aloud yet. What is she doing here? Fine did not answer right away. He was staring at Mara Voss with an expression I had never seen on an Osuvari face before, something between confusion and a kind of ancient, instinctive caution that species without natural predators back home simply do not carry. I do not know, he said finally, but I do not think it is a mistake. I laughed at that, quietly, because it seemed like an absurd thing to say about one small, unarmed human sitting alone in a hall full of apex predators. Of course it was a mistake. Some administrative error, some diplomatic clause misapplied by an overworked clerk, some fluke that would be corrected within days once someone higher up noticed and fixed it. I believed that completely. The way you believe something obvious and simple before the world shows you it is neither. The address ended. Cadets began filing out toward their assigned quarters, still glancing back at the human sitting calmly in the front row, as if she might do something unexpected the moment their attention slipped away. Oren Kess remained seated for a long moment after everyone else had risen, staring at the empty space where his authority had just been, quietly, casually ignored by someone who did not seem to know or care that she had done it. I stayed behind longer than I should have, watching Mara Voss finally rise from her seat, sling a worn canvas bag over one shoulder, and walk toward the exit without a single backward glance at the room full of cadets who had spent the entire address staring at her. She passed close enough to me that I caught the faint scent of something metallic on her clothes, the kind of smell that clings to people who spend time around machinery, engines, weapons systems. Up close, the scar along her jaw looked older than I expected, the kind of mark that comes from something serious, healed a long time ago, rather than a training accident from recent cycles. She glanced at me as she passed, just briefly, and gave me a small nod, the way you might acknowledge a stranger you pass in a corridor without expecting conversation. Then she was gone, walking down the hallway toward the cadet quarters, as if she had lived at Vantheon her entire life. I stood there for a long moment after she left, turning over everything I had just witnessed. A human, alone, unarmed, unarmored, walking into the deadliest academy in known space, and sitting in the seat reserved for the strongest cadet in the room, without hesitation, without fear, smiling the entire time like she had walked into somewhere pleasant instead of somewhere designed to break the unworthy. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself the administration would sort out the error within days, that this strange, small, calm creature would be quietly removed once someone noticed the mistake, and that by next cycle, none of us would remember her name. I did not know yet that the mistake was not hers. The mistake belonged to every single one of us, who assumed we understood what we were looking at. Because 3 days later, during a trial designed to break the confidence of even the strongest incoming cadets, Mara Voss would do something that made Commander Threx Val go pale for the first time in 3 generations of teaching, and the entire academy would begin asking a question none of us were prepared to answer. What exactly is a human, and why did the galaxy agree, so long ago, to leave them alone? The trial began at dawn, though dawn at Vantheon Academy is really just a scheduled lighting cycle inside a station that never sees an actual sun. Cadets gathered in the staging yard, a wide circular field ringed by observation towers, where instructors watched every movement, every flinch, every hesitation that might mark a cadet as unworthy of the rank they claimed. I stood near the front of my cohort, close enough to see Mara Voss standing a few positions away, hands tucked into the pockets of her gray uniform, watching the staging field with the same easy calm she had carried into the orientation hall. Around her, cadets shifted nervously, adjusting straps, testing weapons, running through breathing patterns meant to calm racing hearts before a trial that had, according to Academy records, ended the careers of cadets from stronger species than most of us. This trial had a name among the instructors, though they rarely said it in front of new cadets: the Hollow Run. Officially, it was described as a routine orientation stress assessment. Unofficially, every senior cadet I had spoken to described it the same way, with the same tightness in their voice: a simulated ambush, built to feel completely real, designed specifically to trigger the kind of fear response that separates cadets who could function under pressure from cadets who simply could not. Commander Threx Vol walked the length of the staging field, inspecting the new class with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had watched this exact scene play out for generations and expected nothing new from it. He stopped in front of Mara Voss longer than he stopped in front of anyone else. "You understand the purpose of this trial," he said. "It is not a punishment. It is information. We need to know how you respond when your body believes it is going to die." Mara Voss tilted her head slightly, considering the question with an expression that looked almost thoughtful, as if she were deciding how honestly to answer. "I understand," she said. Her voice was quieter than I expected, steady in a way that did not match the nervous energy radiating from every other cadet in the yard. Vol studied her for a long moment, then moved on without another word, the way you might move past something that did not fit into any category you had prepared for. The trial began the way it always begins, with cadets released one at a time into a section of the station modified to simulate a hostile environment. Lighting dropped to near darkness. Alarms echoed through corridors built to disorient. Holographic threats emerged from side passages, programmed to react with enough realism that most cadets' bodies could not tell the difference between simulation and genuine danger. I went through early in the rotation, and I will admit, even with my training, even with cycles of preparation behind me, the hollow run tested something deep and old in my nervous system. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound behind me made my claws extend before I could stop them. By the time I reached the extraction point, my hearts were pounding hard enough that the medical scanner flagged an elevated stress reading, well within acceptable range, but far from calm. That was the expected outcome. That was, according to every instructor, the entire point. Mara Voss went in near the end of the rotation, and I positioned myself near the observation deck where a handful of cadets who had already completed the trial were allowed to watch the remaining runs on monitor displays, ostensibly for educational purposes. I watched her enter the corridor. The first thing I noticed was her breathing. It did not change. Every other cadet I had watched on those monitors, myself included, had shown some visible shift the moment the lighting dropped and the first distant alarm sounded. A tightening of shoulders, a quickening of pace, some small physical acknowledgement that the body understood danger, even when the mind knew it was simulated. Mara Voss walked forward at a steady, measured pace, scanning the corridor with quick, methodical glances that reminded me less of a nervous cadet and more of someone checking a familiar route out of habit rather than fear. The first holographic threat emerged from a side passage 20 meters ahead of her, a simulated hostile designed to trigger immediate defensive reactions. Every cadet before her had reacted with some combination of retreat, defensive posturing, or a burst of aggressive counter-movement. Mara Voss did not slow down. She adjusted her angle slightly, stepped past the projected threat's simulated attack radius with a small, economical movement that looked almost bored, and kept walking toward the extraction point as if the ambush had been a minor inconvenience rather than a designed threat to her survival. Behind me, I heard one of the observing instructors mutter something under his breath, and I saw him lean closer to the monitor, running a hand over the display controls to check whether the simulation was registering correctly. It was. Mara Voss simply was not reacting the way the simulation expected anyone to react. The second threat came from above, a common tactic in the hollow run, designed to catch cadets who had grown confident after surviving the first encounter. Most cadets, upon hearing movement overhead, either froze or scattered, both instinctive responses the simulation was built to punish with escalating pressure. Mara Voss glanced upward for less than a second, adjusted her stride by perhaps half a meter, and continued forward. The threat's projected attack passed through the space she would have occupied if she had kept her original path. I realized, watching this, that she was not simply lucky or unaffected by fear in some general sense. She was reading the simulation. She was noticing patterns in how the threats emerged, adjusting her movement with small, precise corrections that suggested she had encountered something like this before, many times, under circumstances where the danger had not been simulated at all. By the time she reached the extraction point, 3 full minutes ahead of the average completion time recorded that cycle, the observation deck had gone almost completely silent. Instructors who had watched hundreds of cadets pass through the hollow run over the years stood staring at the monitor with expressions I did not have names for yet, somewhere between professional curiosity and something closer to unease. The medical scanner at the extraction point registered her results, and the number displayed on the overhead board made two instructors exchange a long look. Her stress readings had barely moved from baseline. I want you to understand what that meant to those of us watching. The Hollow Run was built, cycle after cycle, generation after generation, specifically to produce measurable fear responses in even the strongest cadets from the strongest predator worlds. It was not a test of strength. Strength alone did not help you here. It was a test of whether your body understood danger, the way every hunted or hunting creature in the galaxy understood danger, at a level below conscious thought. Mara Voss walked out of that corridor with the same relaxed posture she had carried into the orientation hall 3 days earlier, and when she reached the extraction point, she looked at the medical scanner results glowing above her, tilted her head slightly, and said something that I heard repeated by cadets across the academy for cycles afterward. That was quieter than I expected. She was not being arrogant. I understood that even then, though it took me longer to understand exactly why. She was not boasting or performing confidence for an audience. She genuinely seemed to find the trial unremarkable, the way you might find a familiar task unremarkable after you have done something far harder many times before. Commander Threx Val met her at the extraction point personally, something he rarely did for any cadet regardless of performance. I watched from the observation deck as he studied her results on the display, then studied her face, searching for something I could not identify from that distance. "What did you expect?" he asked her. Mara Voss considered the question for a moment before answering. "Something with teeth," she said. "This didn't have any." Val did not respond right away. He glanced at the instructors beside him, and something passed between them, a silent exchange that suggested they were recalculating something important about the days ahead, about the cadet standing calmly in front of them, about whatever clerical accident had allowed her onto this station in the first place. Word of what happened during the Hollow Run spread through the academy faster than any official announcement could have managed. By evening meal, every cadet in every cohort had heard some version of the story, exaggerated or diminished depending on who was telling it, but the core detail remained consistent across every retelling. The human had walked through the Hollow Run without fear. I sat with Fine that evening in the communal dining hall, picking at a meal I barely tasted, still turning over what I had watched on the observation deck. Around us, conversations buzzed with speculation, some cadets insisting the simulation must have malfunctioned, others quietly wondering aloud whether humans simply did not feel fear the way the rest of us did, a theory that struck me even then as too simple to explain what I had witnessed. Fine ate in his usual silence for a while before speaking. "It was not that she felt no fear," he said quietly. "It was that whatever she has already survived taught her body that this was not something worth fearing." I looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "That is worse," he said. "A creature with no fear response is broken. A creature that has recalibrated its fear response through experience is something else entirely." I did not have an answer for that. I still do not fully, even now, looking back on everything that followed. But I remember glancing across the dining hall that evening and finding Mara Voss sitting alone at a corner table, eating a simple meal with the same unhurried calm she carried everywhere, apparently unaware or uninterested in the fact that every cadet in the room kept glancing at her when they thought she was not looking. She caught me looking. At one point, she did not seem bothered by it. She simply gave me the same small, easy nod she had given me in the corridor 3 days earlier, then went back to her meal, as if being watched by an entire academy of apex predators was simply another unremarkable part of her day. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the way she had moved through that corridor, the small, precise corrections in her stride, the complete absence of panic in a situation engineered specifically to produce panic in even the strongest among us. I thought about what Fine had said, about bodies that recalibrate through experience, and I found myself wondering, for the first time with real unease rather than idle curiosity, exactly what kind of experience could teach a body to treat a simulated ambush as something unremarkable. I did not know yet that my curiosity would lead me somewhere far darker than I expected, into old records the Academy had never bothered to update, records that hinted at exactly why the galaxy had spent generations quietly agreeing to leave humanity alone. I went looking for answers the next morning, before my first scheduled class, in the one place most cadets never bothered to visit. The Academy archive sat in the lower levels of the administration tower, a quiet, poorly lit section of the station, where old records from 1,000 cycles of galactic contact sat gathering dust in databases nobody thought to update anymore. The archivist on duty was an elderly thrall named Corin Basque, half-retired from active service, who spent his days cataloging records nobody read and answering questions nobody asked. He looked up when I entered, mild surprise crossing his weathered face at seeing a first-year cadet in his section this early in the term. I asked him directly, "What do we have on record about humans?" He studied me for a long moment before answering, the way older creatures sometimes study younger ones when they suspect the question carries more weight than the asker realizes. "Not much," he said finally. "And what we have, nobody has bothered updating in generations." He pulled up the record anyway, and I sat beside him at the terminal, while he scrolled through fragments of information that felt less like a species profile and more like scattered rumors someone had reluctantly written down, because leaving nothing on file felt worse than leaving almost nothing. The records confirmed what little I already knew. Humanity had developed outside any of the established galactic pathways, discovered late, contacted cautiously, and then, according to the sparse notes attached to the file, quietly left alone by mutual unspoken agreement between the major powers who had actually made contact with them. There was no formal treaty explaining why, no official diplomatic record detailing a conflict or negotiation that might explain the caution. Just a series of brief, clipped entries from different eras, written by different officials, all carrying the same underlying tone. Recommend minimal engagement. Recommend no further contact pending review. Recommend caution regarding human military capability. Insufficient data. Do not underestimate based on technological comparison alone. That last note had been written almost 200 cycles ago, and nobody, apparently, had ever followed up on it. I asked Corin Basque if he knew anything more, anything not written in the official record, the kind of thing older archivists sometimes carried in memory rather than files. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might refuse to answer at all. Finally he spoke, choosing his words with obvious care. "I served during the border conflicts, 3 generations ago," he said, "before your parents were born. There was an incident, not widely discussed, involving a human vessel that answered a distress call near a contested system. I do not know all the details. What I do know is that whatever happened there caused 3 separate fleets, from 3 separate powers who did not trust each other on anything, to independently reach the same conclusion afterward." "What conclusion?" I asked. "That it was better, for everyone involved, to never give humanity a reason to remember them." He would not say more than that, no matter how I pressed, and I eventually understood that either he genuinely did not know more, or he had decided, in the careful way old soldiers sometimes decide things, that some information was better left where he found it. I left the archive with more questions than I had arrived with, and I carried them with me through the rest of that day, distracted through lectures, distracted through combat drills, thinking about clipped, careful warnings written by officials who clearly knew something they had chosen not to record in detail. By the time I reached the barracks that evening, the whispers among the cadets had grown louder, spreading in the particular way rumors spread among people who feel unsettled and do not fully understand why. Some cadets claimed Mara Voss had been specially trained by some secret human military division, sent to Vantheon deliberately to test our defenses under the cover of a diplomatic loophole. Others insisted the whole thing really was a clerical accident, and that the Academy would quietly correct it once someone higher up finally noticed. Oren Kess, still smarting from the seat he had lost without ever formally losing it, had become the loudest voice among the second group. I overheard him in the training yard that evening, surrounded by a handful of cadets who deferred to his rank, insisting that whatever the human had shown during the hollow run was a fluke, a simulation quirk, nothing that would hold up against a real opponent. I do not think he entirely believed what he was saying. I think, looking back, he needed to say it anyway, the way creatures sometimes need to say something out loud to make themselves believe it might still be true. I did not join that conversation. I had spent the day reading careful, frightened notes written by officials who had clearly seen something they chose never to fully explain, and I found myself, for the first time since arriving at Vantheon, genuinely uncertain about my place in the hierarchy I had spent cycles trying to climb. I saw Mara Voss again that night, in the quiet hour after evening meal, when most cadets retreated to their quarters to rest before the next day's trials. She was in the small outdoor courtyard attached to the cadet housing block, sitting alone on a low wall, looking up at the artificial sky the station projected to simulate night. I almost walked past without speaking. Something made me stop instead. "You are not what everyone expected," I said, which was a clumsy way to open a conversation, but it was the truest thing I could think to say. She looked over at me, and in the dim courtyard light, I noticed something I had not seen clearly before, a tiredness behind her calm expression that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Most people rarely are," she said. I sat down a careful distance away, close enough to talk, far enough to respect whatever boundaries she might want. She did not seem to mind the company, which surprised me a little, given how isolated she had seemed since arriving. I asked her, carefully, why she had chosen Vantheon. I told her, honestly, that I did not fully understand how the enrollment had gone through, that most of the academy assumed it was some kind of mistake. She was quiet for a while before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. "It was not a mistake," she said. "My ship's captain used an old exchange clause because it was the fastest legal path to get me somewhere I could actually train against something other than simulations, built by people who already know everything about me. I did not fully understand what she meant by that at the time, and I did not think to ask her to explain further. I was too focused on the strangeness of hearing her admit, out loud, that the enrollment had been deliberate rather than accidental, that somewhere in the vast unknown territory humanity occupied, someone had decided sending her here was worth the diplomatic risk. I asked her finally, the question that had been building in me since the archive. "What happened to you before you came here?" She looked at me for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes that I recognized, even without fully understanding its source, as the particular quiet of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and has grown used to the weight without ever setting it down. "Things I would rather not put into words tonight," she said, not unkindly, but with a finality that told me not to push further. I respected that. I did not ask again. We sat together in that courtyard a while longer, saying little else, and I found myself, against every instinct my upbringing had trained into me, feeling something closer to sympathy than suspicion toward this strange, calm, quietly exhausted creature who had somehow ended up sitting front row in the deadliest academy in known space. Before I left that night, she said one more thing, almost offhandedly, as if it had just occurred to her. "Your instructors are going to test me again soon," she said. "Something bigger than a simulation." I could tell in the way Commander Val looked at me today. I asked how she knew that. "I have seen that look before," she said. "It usually means someone important wants proof, in front of an audience, that what they are worried about is not real." She was right. Within 2 days, that proof would be demanded in the training yard, in front of the entire cadet class, and the instructor who demanded it would learn, in front of everyone, exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. Commander Threx Vol announced the sparring exhibition during morning assembly, and the way he framed it told me immediately that he had spent the last 2 nights building a careful justification for something he had already decided to do. He stood in front of the assembled cadets, addressing the entire first-year class, with the same measured authority he used for every lecture, though I noticed a tightness in his posture that had not been there during orientation. "Every cadet at Vantheon must demonstrate combat readiness under direct observation," he said. "Simulations test instinct. They do not test true capability against a living opponent. Today, we correct that gap for our newest cadet." He did not say Mara Voss's name. He did not need to. Every head in the assembly turned toward her anyway, and I watched her expression carefully, looking for some sign of the nervousness this announcement should have produced in anyone facing a mandatory public combat trial against an instructor of Val's reputation. She simply nodded once, the same easy acceptance she had shown for everything else since arriving. I want to be fair to Commander Val. Even now, looking back on everything, he was not cruel by nature. He genuinely believed, I think, that testing her openly served a real purpose, that the unease spreading through the cadet ranks needed to be settled one way or another before it undermined discipline across the entire class. And I think, if I am honest, some part of him genuinely believed he would win easily, that whatever she had shown during the hollow run was some strange fluke of simulation design, rather than a true measure of her ability. He was wrong on every count, and the entire academy would watch him learn it in real time. The exhibition took place in the central combat arena, a circular pit surrounded by tiered seating that filled completely within the hour, word having spread through every cohort the moment the announcement was made. Instructors from other divisions arrived to watch. Senior cadets who rarely bothered attending first-year exhibitions found reasons to be present. By the time Commander Val and Mara Voss stepped into the pit, the arena held more spectators than I had seen gathered for any event since my own admission trials. Val wore standard sparring gear, modified for live combat training, the kind designed to prevent lasting injury while still delivering enough force to teach genuine lessons about consequence. He had spent 3 generations training cadets from species built entirely around combat, and his record in these exhibitions was, as far as any cadet could recall, undefeated. Mara Voss wore her simple gray uniform, unmodified, no protective gear beyond the standard padding issued to every cadet for training purposes. She stood across the pit from him, hands loose at her sides, weight balanced evenly, watching him with an expression that held none of the tension gathering in every other body in that arena. The signal sounded. The exhibition began. Val moved first, and I understood immediately why he held his reputation. His attack was fast, precise, calculated to close distance before an opponent could establish any kind of defensive position, the kind of opening move that had ended 100 exhibitions before this one, almost before they truly started. Mara Voss was not there when his strike landed. I do not mean she blocked it, though she did eventually block strikes throughout the exhibition. I mean in that first exchange, she simply was not standing where his attack calculated her to be standing. She had shifted, a small, economical movement executed with a timing that suggested she had read his opening stance and predicted his exact angle of approach before he had finished committing to it. The arena went very quiet. Val recovered quickly, a veteran's instinct overriding surprise, and pressed forward with a second attack, adjusting for the miscalculation. Mara Voss met this one differently, redirecting the force of his strike with a small motion of her forearm that looked, from the observation seats, almost gentle, and used the redirected momentum to step inside his guard. She did not strike him immediately. That was the detail that unsettled me most, watching from the tiered seating. She had a clear opening, a moment where any cadet in that arena would have pressed an advantage as hard and fast as possible. Instead, she paused for a fraction of a second, as if evaluating whether pressing that advantage was actually necessary, before delivering a controlled strike to his shoulder that ended his forward momentum without causing serious injury. Val stepped back, resetting his stance, and I saw something cross his face that I had never seen from him before in 3 cycles of watching him instruct. Not fear exactly, recalculation, the look of someone whose entire framework for understanding an opponent had just been quietly and completely dismantled within the first 15 seconds of a fight he had expected to control from the opening move. He pressed forward again, harder this time, abandoning caution for raw speed and force, the kind of escalation that had overwhelmed every cadet who had faced him during their own exhibitions. The exchange that followed happened faster than most of the cadets in that arena could fully track. I have watched the recording since, slowed down, studied frame by frame the way half the academy studied it in the weeks that followed, and even at reduced speed, it is difficult to describe exactly what happened without sounding like exaggeration. Mara Voss met every strike, redirected every advance, closed every opening Val attempted to create, moving with an economy that used almost no wasted motion, no unnecessary force, nothing beyond exactly what each moment required. She was not simply faster than him, though she was fast. She was reading him, adjusting to patterns he had not yet consciously repeated, anticipating angles before his body had fully committed to them. The exhibition ended when she took him to the ground, a controlled takedown that immobilized him completely within less than a second, applying just enough pressure to end the exchange without causing lasting harm. The arena sat in complete silence. Val lay still for a moment, breathing hard, staring up at the ceiling of the arena, with an expression I recognized even from a distance as genuine shock. Mara Voss released the hold immediately and stepped back, offering him a hand up with the same calm, unhurried manner she had carried through the entire exchange. He did not take her hand right away. He pushed himself up slowly, and when he finally stood, facing her in front of the entire silent arena, he asked the question every cadet in that seating had been screaming inside their own heads. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Mara Voss considered the question for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, a flicker of something that looked almost like regret. "I am sorry," she said. "I held back more than I should have. It made this take longer than it needed to. I want you to understand how that sentence landed in that arena, because it was not arrogance, and every cadet who heard it understood that immediately, which somehow made it far worse than arrogance would have been. She was not boasting about her victory. She was apologizing for the length of the fight, as if a full display of her ability might have ended it in half the time, and the restraint she had shown throughout the exchange had been a courtesy rather than a limitation. Commander Val did not respond right away. He stood there, looking at her, at the arena full of silent cadets, and I watched something settle behind his eyes, the particular stillness of someone recalculating every assumption he had built his entire teaching career around. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it during 3 cycles under his instruction. "Report to the medical wing for a full evaluation," he told her. "Then report to my office. I have questions that require honest answers, and I suspect you are the only cadet in this academy capable of giving me any." She nodded once and walked out of the arena, leaving behind a silence that took nearly a full minute to break, cadets slowly turning to look at each other, searching faces for some shared understanding of what they had just witnessed, and finding, in every face they checked, the same uncertain, unsettled expression they carried themselves. I found Oren Kess afterward, sitting alone near the training yard, staring at nothing in particular. He had been among the loudest voices, insisting the hollow run results meant nothing, that a real opponent would expose whatever advantage the human held. He did not say anything to me when I sat down nearby. He simply stared straight ahead, and after a long silence, he spoke without looking at me, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "I have trained my entire life for a rank that meant something," he said. "I do not know what it means anymore, watching that." I did not have an answer for him. I did not have an answer for myself either, not really. Though something in me had already begun to understand that the question mattering most was not about rank or hierarchy at all. It was about what kind of galaxy had produced a species capable of what we had just watched, and quietly, carefully, chosen to leave that species alone, rather than find out the hard way what happened if you did not. The alert came during the middle of the night cycle, and I only learned about it because Fine shook me awake, his usual composure completely gone, his voice tight with an urgency I had never heard from him before. "Something is happening at the edge of the system," he said. "Come to the observation deck, now." I followed him through corridors filled with other cadets pulled from sleep by the same alerts, all of us moving toward the same destination, with the particular hurried quiet of people who sense something significant unfolding and do not yet understand what it is. By the time we reached the observation deck, it was already crowded with cadets and off-duty instructors, everyone crowded around the wide viewport and the tactical displays mounted along the walls. A raiding fleet had appeared at the outer edge of the system 3 hours earlier, small enough to slip past the Academy's early warning network, coordinated enough to suggest deliberate planning rather than opportunistic attack. Border raiders had tested this sector before, cycles ago, probing for weaknesses in the Alliance's defenses, but nothing on this scale, and nothing this precisely timed. I looked at the tactical display and understood immediately why the timing mattered. The raiders had chosen a window when several defense vessels from the Academy's protective fleet were away on a routine training rotation, leaving the station and its surrounding system more exposed than it had been in generations. They were not attacking Vantheon directly, not yet. Their formation suggested a strike against a small mining colony on the system's 3rd planet. An easy target with minimal defenses, the kind of raid that could be completed and withdrawn from before any significant response arrived. Except something else was already moving through the system, and it was not part of the Academy's fleet at all. The human vessel, The same compact gray warship that had arrived weeks earlier, requesting nothing more than routine dock and resupply, had broken orbit from the station without formal notification, without requesting clearance, without any of the diplomatic procedure that governed vessel movement within Academy-controlled space. I watched the tactical display update in real time as the ship's projected course intersected directly with the Raider's approach vector, and around me, I heard instructors murmuring urgently to each other, some reaching for communication panels to demand explanation, others simply staring at the display with expressions I recognized now, having seen that same look on Commander Val's face days earlier. The response, when it came, was fast. Faster than anything I had studied in tactical theory. Faster than anything the Academy's own defense doctrine considered survivable for a single vessel engaging a coordinated raiding formation without support. I will not pretend I understood every detail of what unfolded on that display over the following minutes. I am not a fleet tactician, but I understood enough to recognize that whatever doctrine the human vessel operated under bore almost no resemblance to anything taught within these walls. It did not attempt to establish a defensive perimeter around the mining colony, the standard approach any Academy-trained officer would have used to protect civilian assets while awaiting reinforcement. It moved directly toward the raiding formation itself, closing distance with a speed that left several instructors on the observation deck audibly reacting, and engaged before the raiders had fully registered a response was even inbound. The engagement lasted, according to the timestamp on the tactical log, under 4 minutes. I watched raider signatures blink out of the display one after another, not in the gradual attrition pattern of a prolonged battle, but in the rapid, almost immediate sequence of a force that had been given no meaningful opportunity to adapt or retreat. 2 raider vessels attempted to break formation and flee once the engagement's outcome became apparent. Neither made it clear of the system before their signatures vanished from the display as well. By the time the tactical display stabilized into a clean, uncontested reading, the raiding formation that had threatened the mining colony no longer existed as a coherent force. The human vessel held position near the colony for several minutes afterward, its energy signature settling into a passive, watchful pattern, before finally returning to its original orbit around the Academy station, requesting, once again, nothing more than routine dock clearance, as if it had simply stepped out to handle a minor inconvenience. The observation deck stayed silent for a long time after the tactical display returned to its normal quiet state. I found myself thinking, standing there in that silence, about the sparring exhibition days earlier, about Mara Voss apologizing for holding back more than she should have, about a fight that could have ended far faster than it did. I thought about the hollow run, about her calm, measured movement through a corridor, engineered to break confidence, about her quiet observation that the simulation had nothing with teeth. I understood, finally, standing on that observation deck, watching a tactical display go quiet after a battle that should have taken far longer and cost far more than it apparently had, that everything we had watched Mara Voss do over the past several days had not been an anomaly at all. It had been a sample, a small, careful, restrained sample of a much larger doctrine that the vessel now settling back into orbit around our station represented at full scale. Commander Val arrived on the observation deck not long after the engagement concluded, and I watched him study the tactical logs with an expression that had settled, sometime over the past several days, into something quieter and more serious than the confident authority he had carried during orientation. He did not address the assembled cadets directly. He simply stood at the display for a long time, reading through the engagement data, and when he finally spoke, it was quietly, to another instructor standing near him, though several of us close enough overheard it anyway. 4 minutes, he said. A full raiding formation, coordinated, prepared, and it took them 4 minutes to stop existing. The other instructor did not respond right away. When she did, her voice carried the same unsettled quiet. "That is 1 vessel," she said. 1. And it did not even request permission before engaging. Val was silent for a long moment before answering. "I do not think it needed permission," he said. "I think, wherever that vessel comes from, waiting for permission before responding to a threat is not how they are built to think." I left the observation deck that night carrying a different understanding of everything I had witnessed since Mara Voss first walked into the orientation hall and sat in a seat she had no formal right to claim. I had spent days thinking of her as an exception, a single strange anomaly who had somehow slipped through an administrative gap into an academy built for species far larger and more heavily armed than her own. I understood now that I had misunderstood the entire situation from the very beginning. She was not an exception at all. She was a representative sample, deliberately placed among us, of exactly the kind of capability the vessel in orbit above our station had just demonstrated to an entire raiding fleet in under 4 minutes, without hesitation, without escalation, without the slightest indication that the engagement had required anything close to its full potential. I did not sleep well that night, turning over a single question that I suspected every instructor and every cadet across the academy was quietly asking themselves in the darkness of their own quarters. If this was what humanity showed us when restrained, calm, and deliberately holding back, what exactly had the galaxy agreed, so many generations ago, never to find out? The High Council convened an emergency session 2 days after the engagement, and word of what would be discussed there spread through the academy long before any official announcement confirmed it. They were debating whether to revoke Mara Voss's enrollment, to quietly undo the diplomatic clause that had placed her among us, and remove her from Vantheon before the situation, whatever the situation actually was, grew any further beyond their understanding or control. I learned about the session because Commander Val, in an unusual move that surprised every cadet who heard about it, requested that a small number of first-year cadets attend as observers. I do not know exactly why he chose the cadets he chose. I was among them, along with Fane, and I have wondered since whether he selected us specifically because we had both, in our own ways, shown more curiosity about Mara Voss than fear of her. The council chamber sat at the top of the administration tower, a wide circular room ringed with representatives from every founding world that had contributed to Vantheon's establishment generations earlier. I had never been inside that chamber before, and the weight of the room, the formal severity of it, made the whole situation feel heavier than any classroom exercise or training exhibition ever had. Mara Voss stood at the center of the chamber, alone, facing the assembled council, with the same calm posture she carried everywhere, though I noticed, watching closely, a tension in her shoulders that had not been there during the sparring exhibition. Whatever came out of this session mattered to her in a way that a training fight, apparently, did not. The council's presiding officer, an elder Velkari named Soren Thess, whose reputation for caution was well known even to first-year cadets, opened the session with a summary of the events of the past several days. The Hollow Run, the sparring exhibition, the engagement against the raiding fleet, and the vessel's failure to request clearance before acting. This academy exists to train the strongest species in known space, to defend our shared territory, Soren Thess said. It was never designed to host a species whose true capability we do not understand, and whose vessel demonstrates a willingness to act without consultation the moment it perceives a threat. Several council members voiced agreement, their concerns ranging from practical worry about precedent to something closer to old, instinctive unease that I recognized from Fine's face during the Hollow Run. One representative argued that keeping Mara Voss enrolled sent a dangerous signal to every other power watching the sector, suggesting that Vantheon's traditional entrance standards could be circumvented by any species clever enough to invoke an old diplomatic clause. I watched Mara Voss listen to all of this without interrupting, without defending herself, standing quietly at the center of the chamber, while representatives of a dozen founding worlds debated whether she belonged among us, as if she were not standing right there listening to every word. It was Commander Val who finally spoke in her defense, and I remember being surprised by that, given how thoroughly his own assumptions had been dismantled during the sparring exhibition days earlier. I have taught cadets at this academy for 3 generations, he said. I have never encountered a combatant whose capability I could not, eventually, map and understand within the framework of our own training doctrine. I still cannot fully explain what I witnessed in that arena. I do not believe that is a reason to remove her. I believe it is the single most valuable reason we have ever had to keep her here. Soren Thess studied him carefully before responding. Explain, she said. Val gestured toward the tactical logs displayed on the chamber's central screen, the same engagement data I had watched unfold on the observation deck. We spent generations agreeing to leave humanity alone, he said. without ever understanding why that agreement mattered so much to species who agreed on almost nothing else. We have a rare, direct opportunity now to actually understand what we have been avoiding, through a cadet who has shown remarkable restraint and no hostile intent toward this academy or anyone within it. If we remove her out of discomfort, we lose that opportunity, and we remain exactly as unprepared as we were before that raiding fleet made the mistake of testing this system's defenses. The chamber fell into a long, considering silence. I watched several council members exchange glances, weighing Val's argument against whatever instinctive caution had brought them to this session in the first place. Soren Thess turned finally to Mara Voss directly, addressing her for the first time since the session began. "Why did your vessel not request clearance before engaging the raiding fleet?" she asked. Standard diplomatic procedure required consultation before independent military action within Academy-controlled space. Mara Voss answered without hesitation, her voice steady, carrying none of the defensiveness I might have expected from someone whose future at the Academy hung on this exact conversation. "My captain has served under doctrine built from a long history of losing people while waiting for permission that arrived too late to matter," she said. "When lives are at risk, we act first and explain afterward. I understand that this makes some of you uncomfortable. I understand why. But I would rather stand here explaining an uncomfortable decision than stand somewhere else explaining why we chose not to act in time." Soren Thess considered this for a long moment. "And your own presence here," she said. "What do you hope to gain from a place that clearly was not built to welcome you?" Mara Voss was quiet for a moment before answering, and when she did, something in her voice shifted, quieter and more honest than anything I had heard from her before. "I have spent most of my life training against threats my own people already understand too well," she said. "I came here because I wanted to learn how other species think, how you train, how you build strength differently than we do. I did not come here to prove anything about what my species can do. I think that part happened without anyone asking me to demonstrate it." The chamber sat in silence after that, and I watched Soren Thess study her for a long time. The same careful, evaluating expression I had seen on Corin Basque's face in the archive, on Val's face after the sparring exhibition, on every instructor and cadet who had spent enough time near Mara Voss to understand that whatever she represented deserved far more caution and far more respect than dismissal. The council did not reach a decision that day. Sessions like that rarely resolve quickly, and this one carried weight far beyond a single cadet's enrollment status. But word spread through the academy within hours that the discussion had shifted, quietly but unmistakably, away from removal and toward something closer to careful, deliberate cooperation. I left that chamber that evening thinking about everything I had witnessed over the past several days. The calm, unarmed human who had walked into the deadliest academy in known space and simply sat where she chose. The quiet restraint behind every trial she had passed without visible effort. The 4-minute engagement that had erased an entire raiding formation without a single request for permission. I understood, finally, standing in that quiet corridor outside the council chamber, exactly what Fine had meant that first evening in the dining hall, all those days ago, when he told me that a creature who has recalibrated its fear response through hard experience is something else entirely. We had spent generations building an academy, meant to identify and train the strongest species in known space. We had never once considered that the strongest species might already exist, quietly restrained, deliberately careful, choosing patience over demonstration for reasons none of us had bothered to ask about, until one small, calm, unarmed cadet walked into our orientation hall and sat down in a seat she had no right to claim. The council's final decision came 3 days later, delivered through a formal announcement posted across every cadet terminal at Vantheon. Mara Voss would remain enrolled, her status formally recognized rather than quietly tolerated, and the Academy would, for the first time in its long history, establish an official framework for studying and integrating capability from species outside its traditional predator classifications. I do not think anyone fully understood, reading that announcement, how much had actually shifted in the space of a few short weeks. I certainly did not completely. Not until I watched the next orientation assembly for the small handful of additional cadets who transferred in through the same reopened diplomatic pathway that had first brought Mara Voss among us. I want to tell you about the morning everything settled into what it would become, because I think it says more about what changed than any council transcript ever could. The orientation hall filled the same way it always did. Cadets from a dozen predator worlds finding their places in the tiered seating, sizing each other up out of old habit. Mara Voss walked in through the same doors she had walked through weeks earlier, and this time, when she moved down the center aisle toward the front row, nobody stopped talking. Nobody stared with the same open hostility I remembered from her first day. A few cadets nodded to her as she passed. The particular quiet respect predator species offer to something they have learned, through hard demonstration, actually deserves it. She sat down in the front row seat again, the same seat she had claimed without permission on her very first day, except now it genuinely belonged to her, earned rather than simply taken. In a way, every cadet in that hall understood, without needing it explained. I sat a few rows back, watching her settle into that seat with the same easy, unhurried calm she had carried since the moment I first saw her, and I found myself thinking about everything that had unfolded since that first day. The hollow run, the sparring exhibition, the 4-minute engagement that had erased a raiding fleet without a single request for permission, the careful, considering silence of a council chamber weighing generations of quiet avoidance against the value of finally, actually understanding what they had spent so long choosing not to know. I approached her after the assembly ended, and she greeted me with the same small, easy nod she had given me in the corridor on her very first day, though something in her expression had softened slightly since then. The tiredness I had noticed during our conversation in the courtyard, replaced by something closer to genuine, quiet contentment. I asked her how it felt, now that the council had made its decision, now that the whispers and suspicion that had followed her through those first difficult weeks had largely faded into something closer to respect. She considered the question for a moment before answering, the same thoughtful pause I had come to recognize as genuinely hers, rather than performed for an audience. "It feels like the beginning of something I actually wanted," she said. "I did not come here to be feared. I came here because I wanted to learn how other people build strength, and I wanted, eventually, for someone here to understand that my people are not something to be quietly avoided forever. We are just people who learned hard lessons early, and never forgot them." I asked her, finally, the question that had been sitting with me since that first conversation in the courtyard, since Corin Basque's careful, unfinished warning in the archive, since every clipped, cautious note buried in generations of galactic records. What actually happened, all those generations ago, that made everyone decide it was safer to leave your people alone? She was quiet for a long moment, and I thought, for a moment, that she would deflect the question the way she had that first night in the courtyard. Instead, she looked at me directly, and something in her expression carried the weight of history rather than personal memory, the kind of knowledge passed down through generations rather than lived firsthand. "We do not have a peaceful history," she said, "not with each other, and not, eventually, with anyone who mistook our patience for weakness. My people learned, a long time ago, exactly how much cost we are willing to accept to protect what matters to us. Other powers who encountered that lesson early decided it was wiser never to test it again. I think that is the real reason nobody talks about it much. Not because it is a secret, because it is simply better, for everyone, if it never has to be demonstrated a second time." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, walking back through the academy corridors toward my own quarters, past cadets from a dozen predator worlds who had spent generations believing themselves the deadliest species in known space, simply because nobody had ever given them a reason to consider otherwise. I understood, finally, standing in that quiet corridor, exactly what had walked into our orientation hall all those weeks earlier, wearing a simple gray uniform, smiling easily, sitting calmly in a seat she had no formal right to claim. We had spent generations building an academy to identify and refine the deadliest warriors known space could produce, confident that our own predator worlds represented the ceiling of what violence, discipline, and strength could accomplish together. We had never once considered that somewhere beyond our careful, well-mapped borders, a quiet, cautious species had already learned every lesson we were still teaching ourselves, and had simply chosen, generation after generation, not to demonstrate it unless genuinely necessary. Mara Voss did not come to Vantheon to prove anything. I believe that completely, even now. She came because she was curious, because she wanted to understand how other worlds built their own strength, because some part of her, tired from whatever hard history had shaped her before she ever stepped foot on our station, simply wanted to sit somewhere new and learn. But in doing exactly that, quietly, patiently, without ever raising her voice or reaching for more force than each situation strictly required, she taught every cadet at this academy something far more valuable than any lesson our own instructors had prepared us for. The galaxy had spent generations quietly agreeing to leave humanity alone, not out of courtesy, and not out of indifference, but out of a hard-learned respect too old and too careful to ever fully explain itself. I think about that every time I pass the front row of the orientation hall now, the seat that once belonged, by unspoken tradition, to whoever proved themselves the strongest cadet in the room. Mara Voss still sits there, every single morning, the same easy grin on her face, and not a single cadet at this academy has ever again questioned whether she has earned the right to claim it. She did not need to prove she belonged there. She only needed to sit down and let the rest of us slowly understand exactly what we were looking at.